Hey everyone, this is MJ. In this session today, we'll be talking about how to decentralize any frontend using NEAR's blockchain operating system. And my apologies if I sound a little bit tired because I just got COVID again. All right, so before we get started, just a quick intro of myself. So I currently work at a company called Proximity Labs. We are a team that is focused on helping Web3 projects in the NEAR and Aurora ecosystems, and we provide monetary support in the form of grants and investments, as well as non-monetary support, such as technical advisory, tokenomics design, community building, and so forth. And before joining Proximity Labs, I spent 7 years at Microsoft as a product manager. I helped to build a cloud computing service there from scratch to a 9-digit business. And my specialty was kind of in the platform as a service, serverless, Kubernetes, and API space. And during my time there, I also had the opportunity to advise over 100 of Fortune companies on their cloud strategy, especially around application modernization. And prior to that, I also spent a few years in the traditional finance space, building high-frequency trading algorithms, risk engines, and so forth. All right, so just quickly get a temperature of the room. Could you please type 1 in the chat if you consider yourself a developer? All right, there we go. Thank you, thank you. All right, and if you consider yourself a Web3 developer, could you please type, we are gonna make it, WAGMI in the chat? Okay, awesome, thank you. Awesome, perfect. All right, so yeah, looks like we have a good mix today. So here's my agenda for today. We will first be quickly going through the evolution of the web from Web 1 to Web 3, and I also talk about some of the core ideas of Web 3 and why decentralization is very important. And then we will move on to why you should consider decentralizing your front end. And I will also give you a quick overview of the blockchain operating system, which I believe is the best and easiest solution on the market right now for building decentralized front ends. I will also show you a demo of the BOS, basically walk you through how to prototype and build front ends using the BOS. And finally, we will conclude with Q&A. So my goal for today is that hopefully by the end of the session, you will learn a little bit about Web3, its core concepts, and as well as learning a little bit about the blockchain operating system and how it can help you decentralize your applications. And the content for today will be a mix of both conceptual and technical details. All right, so over the last 3 decades, we have witnessed the evolution of the web from Web 1.0 to Web 3.0, right? Web 1.0 was kind of the first iteration, and you can think of it as as the read-only web, right? Because in Web 1, users were passively consuming all the information that was fed to us, right? Think about websites like Yahoo or AOL, right? And as users, we could not contribute information or content for other users to consume in Web 1. So the entire internet was kind of like a giant Wikipedia, but hyperlinked all together, right? And then Web 2 emerged during the year of 2004. And in Web 2, users can not just consume data, but also contribute information and data that other users can consume, right? Imagine, think about, the videos we upload to YouTube or the tweets that we share on Twitter, right? And Web 2 became this, social and interactive web where users cannot just read and write, but but also write information to the internet. But unfortunately, Web 2, as it is today, right, it is very centralized. The majority of the internet is owned and controlled by a small group of companies, right, such as Facebook, Amazon, Google, and so forth, right? So this leads to problems like, censorship, the lack of data ownership, privacy, and so forth, right? So Web 3 is the latest evolution of the web. It really tries to empower users to not just read and write, but also own the information and the data that they produce online, right? So you can think of Web 3 as the read and write and own web, right? So here are some of the core ideas of Web 3. So first of all, Web 3 is decentralized, right? As ownership gets more, distributed, users will gain more control, right? And there should be less lock-in risk. And in addition to that, users can also participate in the governance of the projects and applications that they use, right? And number two, Web3 is also permissionless, right? It means that everyone should be able to participate and no one should be excluded. And you should not need to ask for anyone for permission in order to use any application. And number three, Web3 also has its native payments leveraging cryptocurrencies, right? So it does not need to rely on kind of the outdated traditional financial infrastructure or payment processors and so forth. And last but not the least, because Web3 has its native payments using cryptocurrencies, it can be trustless, right? Because it can operate it can operate on incentives and economic mechanisms instead of relying on trusted centralized parties or authorities. However, a very important thing here is that to actually realize these core ideas of Web3, the architecture of Web3 applications are designed on top of the principles of decentralization. So let's first take a look at a very high-level architecture of a typical Web2 application today, right? So as you can see, this is a very typical, client-server application in Web2. And there are three components here. On the right-hand side here, we have a database, right? This could be a SQL database or a NoSQL database for persisting the state of our application, right? And then in the middle, we have the backend service, which implements your business logic and handles all the CRUD operations of the database, right? And then on the left-hand side here, we have the front-end service, which basically provides an interface for users to interact with your application. And and obviously the front-end will interact with the back-end via APIs. So in comparison, here is a very high-level, oversimplified architecture of a typical Web3 application today. As you can see, the biggest difference here is decentralization, right? So instead of relying on a centralized database, you can actually leverage the blockchain to persist the state of your application. And in this case, the blockchain becomes a state machine, right? And the state machine is spread across the network of computers, aka nodes, inside the blockchain network, right? And then your backend service, your business logic, can be implemented using something called smart contract. And if you are not familiar with the jargon, you can think of it as a piece of code that is deployed onto the blockchain and will be executed by all the nodes inside the blockchain network, right? So, by leveraging the blockchain, as you can see, we immediately decentralize our backend service and our database, right? Because they no longer depend on a single cloud provider or a hosting provider, right? They actually runs on a network of computers inside the blockchain network. So there's no single point of failure, there's no single points of censorship, and it's fully decentralized. And finally, we still have the front-end service, which provides an interface for users to interact with the application, right? And this is an oversimplified picture. In reality, the front-end actually interact with the blockchain via something called RPC. You can think of it as an API server, right? So this is a typical architecture of most of the Web3 applications today. So if we look at the picture, right, do we see any problem here? Well, so even though most of the Web3 applications today, leverage the blockchain to decentralize their backend and their database, right? In fact, most of the Web3 applications today, they still leverage one of the cloud providers to host their front-end application, such as GCP or AWS or Microsoft Azure, right? So in this case, their front-end is still centralized, right? Because it still relies on a single hosting provider. So why should we decentralize our front ends as well, right? Well, let me ask you this, right? Do we think an application is really decentralized if it is still centralized at the point of entry, right? It is a little bit mouthful to say. And here are some concerns of centralized front ends, right? Number one is that those hosting providers are single points of failure, right? If we look at all the hosting providers that's available out there, and if we review the history in the last let's say 10 years, we can find major outages across every single one of them, right? Actually, if you go to the Wikipedia page of AWS, for example, you can actually see the list of all their outages since their inception. So those hosting providers, they are single point of failure. And number two is that hosting providers, they might not share our community ethos, right? What does that mean is that if you are working in a new industry such as Web3, given the ambiguity and uncertainty in regulation right now, right, it is not guaranteed that those hosting providers will continue to host our content, right? In fact, they might take down our content at any time, right? And number three is that users are unaware of changes and updates to the front ends under the current paradigm of front end hosting. This is a big issue to me because as users, we are not even aware of which version of the front end we are running, even if those front ends are open source, right? So there's no guarantee that the front end is trustworthy and there's nothing malicious in there, right? And finally, if a project or an application only has a single front end, which is controlled by a centralized development team, right? This means that stakeholders are at the whim of the development team, right? Because the dev team can choose to do something that may not serve the best interest of the stakeholders, such as users, investors, token holders, and so forth, right? So these are some of the concerns of centralized front ends. And let's take a look at some examples here. So number one is that Amazon actually had a major outage, right, back in June this year, which impacted thousands of their users, right? And a few years ago, Microsoft also had a major outage in one of their data centers in the US, which turned out to be a very important data center because a lot of the enterprise-y and mission critical applications were using that data center. And unfortunately, I had the opportunity to experience the entire crisis during my time there. And it was not a fun experience. And also, if you are in Web3, you probably know that earlier this year, the Arbitrum website actually was down during their highly anticipated airdrop. And during that time, normal users could not claim their tokens. Only those advanced users who understood how to interact with the blockchain directly could claim their tokens first and dump it on the market before anyone else, right? So this was totally unfair. And then another Web3 application called Uniswap. If you are not familiar with them, you can think of it as an exchange where users can buy and sell tokens there. So Uniswap, they decided to delist over 100 tokens in 2021 from their user interface, right? So that users could no longer trade those tokens. And this was a sole decision by the development team of Uniswap. And it was not reviewed or discussed among their user community. And another Web3 project called Curve actually had a hack last year. And basically, the hacker pointed the front end to a malicious smart contract, right? But users were not aware of this change, right? So they continued to use the front end to do their transactions. And unfortunately, they lost over $500,000 US because of this hack. So this is another example showing that users, what could happen if users were not aware of any changes to the front end, or if they were not aware of the version of the front end that they are running. All right, so now you might be asking, okay, but how do we decentralize our front ends, right? Okay, let's enter the blockchain operating system. So what is the blockchain operating system, right? So to end users, this is a common layer for browsing and discovering all the open web experiences. So what does that mean, right? Imagine if there's a website where users can go and discover all the Web3 experiences that's available right now, right? This would be a substantial improvement over our existing user experience, which is quite fragmented, right? And in fact, this is no longer a dream. This is actually a reality. So if you go to NEAR.org today, you can actually already, be able to use an early version of the blockchain operating system. And on NEAR.org, you can actually discover thousands of applications that are, developed using the BOS technology. And another thing to mention here is that the blockchain operating system is compatible with any blockchain, right? So if you go to NEAR.org right now, you can actually find applications that are developed not just on NEAR, but also on other blockchains such as Arbitrum, Ethereum Mainnet, Polygon, zkEVM, and so forth. And then to developers, right, the blockchain operating system is a new tech stack for building fully decentralized applications. So the keyword here is fully decentralized, right? This means that developers can build applications, can decentralize not just their backend and database, but also decentralize the front end of their applications. So, so we created the blockchain operating system because we wanted to provide a unified solution for all the problems across Web 2 and Web 3, right? So in Web 2, as I mentioned earlier, we already have a number of existing problems such as censorship, lack of data ownership, and lack of privacy, right? But unfortunately, in Web 3, we already have our own problems, such as fragmentation, right? So each ecosystem today in Web 3 has its own applications, has its own tooling, has its own wallet, right? So it is a very fragmented experience. If you are a user who are using Ethereum, you might be using something like MetaMask. But if you want to explore something like Solana, you might need to learn something like the Phantom wallet, right? So it's a very fragmented experience. And this leads to another problem, which is discoverability, right? If you are a new user and you're exploring a new ecosystem in Web 3, right? So it will take you some time to discover all the marquee, trustworthy, real applications in that ecosystem, right? And then between Web 2 and Web 3, they also share some common issues, such as how do you onboard new users to your application, right? How do you deliver the so-called 5 minutes to wow, right? And then how do you distribute your service and a product to as many users as possible, right? And infrastructure management is always a challenge, right? If you're in Web 2, you might be, worrying about, managing your virtual machines, your Kubernetes clusters, your, Lambda functions, and so forth. But if you're in Web 3, even though you can leverage the blockchain for your applications, for your backend services and database, you still have the front end to worry about, right? And as I mentioned earlier, most of the Web 3 applications still host their front end using one of the cloud providers such as AWS or GCP. So those infrastructure management, they are never serverless, right? They are never they're always a non-trivial task. So that's why we are trying to solve all these issues, all these challenges with a unified solution in the blockchain operating system. And here is a high-level overview of how the BOS stack looks like. So as you can see, at the very bottom of the stack, we have the blockchain layer, right? So this is kind of the backbone layer, and this is where your trust, your assets, your identity, your transaction are happening, right? And if you are building a Web3 application, we would love to have you in the NEAR blockchain. But as I mentioned earlier, the BOS is also chain agnostic, so you are also welcome to use any other blockchain that's available out there, including Ethereum Mainnet and so forth, right? And then on top of the blockchain layer, so we have another layer called the middleware layer, right? So this is a layer of RPCs, indexers, notification services, and so forth. So the goal of the middleware layer is to provide the same experience that we are all used to in Web 2, right? And for example, if you are searching for something, you should be able to get a result instantly instead of needing to traverse the entire blockchain in real time, right? So this is why this layer is also sometimes called the data platform layer, right? Because the goal here is really to make it easy and fast to access the on-chain data. And then on top of the middleware layer, we have 2 layers for building the user interfaces. And this is the new thing that we are introducing with the blockchain operating system. So the way it works is very simple. Imagine if you have a front end, right? You can componentize this front end into a BOS component. This is very similar to how you would componentize a front end using like React.js. And once you have this BOS component developed, right, you can then deploy it to the NEAR blockchain, right? And so basically, you are deploying the source code like JavaScript, CSS, to the NEAR blockchain, and it's very similar to how you would deploy a smart contract to a blockchain. So essentially, what we did to front end here is very similar to what smart contract did to backend services. So once you deploy the source code of your front end onto the blockchain, right, you instantly decentralize your front end, because now the front end actually runs on top of the network, the blockchain network, right, the network of nodes inside the blockchain. It does not depend on a single server or a single hosting provider. And there's no single point of failure, and it will be highly available and very, very resilient, right? And in addition to that, because the source code is deployed on the blockchain, right, it also means that the source code of your front end is open source and transparent by default, right? Because anyone can go to the blockchain explorer and view and audit the source code of your front end at any time, right? And then once you have these front end components deployed on the blockchain, right, then we need places where users can discover and interact with these front-end components, right? So this is where the gateways come into play, right? So gateways basically provide an interface for users to discover, browse, and interact with these on-chain components. And gateways can be anything. And it can be a standalone website like NEAR.org. It can be an existing app like a portfolio app or information app. For example, DeFi Llama can actually easily, become a BOS gateway and render all the BOS components inside their application, so that users do not need to go to a different site or tab to use those applications. And gateways can also be a wallet or a browser like Brave, right? And it's extremely easy to run a gateway or become a gateway. We already have a number of gateways that's available out there, and we anticipate many more to come in the near future. And finally, at the very top of the stack, we have the onboarding layer, right? So this is the layer of services and products that aim to make it extremely easy for users to onboard to your application. And if you look at this stack here, right? So this is a full stack from the blockchain all the way to onboarding, right? As a developer, you can actually choose the services and products that you want to use, right, inside of this stack. You don't have to use everything. For example, if you are just interested in building a decentralized front end for your existing application, you can just use the user interface layer, right? But if you are building a new application from scratch, then you can decide to use maybe the NEAR blockchain to host your smart contracts and the middleware layer as well. So yeah, so you can actually choose the components that you want to use from the stack, and compare it to in the traditional cloud providers, right? This entire stack is actually permissionless, right? You don't have to call anyone or email anyone to create an account or create a subscription to use this stack. You can actually just come and go, use anything that you like, and stop using it if it doesn't work for you. All right, so and here are some of the benefits of using the blockchain operating system for building your front ends. So number one is access, right? Because your source code is deployed on the blockchain, so it is decentralized, right? So there's no single point of censorship or single point of failure, right? Because it does not rely on a single server, so anyone can access your front end at any time, right? And number two is security, because the source code of your front end is deployed on chain, so it's open source and transparent by default, right? So anyone can come and view and audit your source code at any time, and they can help you, discover, bugs and issues inside your code and help improve the security of your front end. And number 3 is agility, right? So you will see in my demo that BOS is actually extremely easy. It's actually extremely easy to prototype and build Web3 applications using the blockchain operating system. And also, once you deploy your application onto the BOS, right? So anyone can actually discover your component through one of the gateways out there, right? So when we have more gateways, actually there will be more discovery points of your application. And one thing I didn't mention yet is that all these BOS components, they're actually highly reusable. You can actually easily remix and reuse and compose them into new experiences, which I will show you in a minute in my demo. This really facilitates innovation. And also, because the source code of the front end is deployed on chain, right? You can actually build a process so that every single improvement, every single update to the front end needs to go through something like a DAO proposal, right? This is another very interesting and useful use case. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, the blockchain operating system is chain agnostic, which means that you can use it to create front ends that work with smart contracts on any blockchain, which I will also show you in a minute. All right, so without further ado, let's take a look at a demo of the BOS. Let me switch to my browser. Okay, so what we are looking here is NEAR.org, right? As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the many gateways for the blockchain operating system. And also the job of the gateway, as I mentioned earlier, is to provide an access point where users can discover, browse, and interact with all the on-chain components, right? And essentially what happens is that the gateway will talk to the RPC server to fetch the source code of the front end from the blockchain and renders it to the user, right? So everything you see on this page is actually fetched from the blockchain. And apart from that, right, it is totally up to the owner or the developer of the gateway to decide what other feature or what other flavor they want to add to the gateway, right? So as you can see, NEAR.org actually looks very similar to a social network, right? In fact, it is a social network where users can actually interact with each other. They can discover front ends developed by other developers. They can also comment on those components. They can follow each other and so forth, right? So if we look at this page, you can see that on the left-hand side here, we can see the featured components that's selected and curated by the owner of this gateway. And in the middle is the social feed, right? Excuse me. So I can see updates from people that I follow. And on the right-hand side here, I can discover the latest news in the ecosystem and new users who have joined, follow activity, and so forth, right? So it's very similar to a social network. It's kind of like, you can think of it as like a social network for Web3 users. And then if I go to the Discover tab here, if I go to Components, I can see that I can actually discover over 10,000 components that have already been developed using the blockchain operating system, right? So for example, if I see something that looks interesting, I can just view details, and I will open the detail of these components. If I go to source, I can actually instantly view the source code of these components, right? And this is super useful because as a user, if I want to use these components, I can quickly go through the code to make sure that everything looks good. There's nothing malicious there. And if I go to history here, I can also see all the previous commits of this components, right? And this is kind of like GitHub, but it's implemented on the blockchain, right? And it's super useful because if I only trust a specific version of this front end, right, I can also choose to use that specific version. And also as a developer, if I am interested in using this component, right, I can actually click the fork button here. So this will instantly open the in-browse editor of the blockchain operating system, and where I can instantly see the source code of this component, and I can make changes to it, improve it, or also embed it in my existing application, right? So this is really, the power of the blockchain operating system, the power of open source, right? Okay. So now let's take a look at some examples here. So first, let's take a look at this hello world example, right? So this is a very, very simple, component. Essentially, as you can see, this is just a piece of JSX, right? At the top of it, I'm writing some JavaScript code, right, to define the greeting message. And here is the output of the user interface. Basically, I'm just rendering the greeting message. So if I click the render preview button here, I can instantly view the results of my code, right? So this is how easy you can actually prototype a front end inside this editor. But if you prefer to work locally in an IDE, you can also download our VS Code extension, where you can work on your code for your components locally, on your computer. Okay, so if I make some changes to my code, let's say add 3 explanations. If I render it again, as you can see, I instantly see the change that I just made, right? So this is how easy you can play with it. Okay, so now you might be thinking, okay, so this is an extremely simple example, right? But how can we build something more realistic? Okay, so let's say I want, instead of hard coding the greeting message right here, right? Let's say I want to build a real Web3 application where I have a smart contract deployed on the blockchain, and the smart contract will be persisting the greeting message. And the smart contract has 2 functions, right? Number 1 is a read function, which will read the latest greeting message from the smart contract. And number 2 is a write function, which will update the greeting message, right? So I actually have the application, have the smart contract written already. So it's deployed to the NEAR blockchain. As I mentioned, it has 2 functions, the read and write functions. So now I want to build a user interface that fetches the latest greeting message from the smart contract, and also allows users to update the greeting message, right? So this is how the code of the user interface. As you can see, it's very simple. So the first line here is just the address of the smart contract on NEAR. And the second line here is basically using the NEAR object to call the view function of the contract. The name of the function is called getGreetings, right? So with BOS, we try to provide most of the libraries and the functionalities that developers might need through APIs. As you can see here, I'm using the NEAR object to call the smart contract, right? It's extremely simple, just a 1 line here. And then we're just updating the state as what we usually do with React.js. And there are a couple helper functions here. Number 1 is to update the state once user update the input. And once the button is clicked, we will call another function of the smart contract to update the greeting message in the smart contract. Right? As you can see, we are using the NEAR object again, but this time we are using the call function to call this write function inside the contract. And finally, we are just defining the output of the component, which is extremely simple. So with less than 60 lines of code, we have written a real application, a real front end, which interacts with a smart contract deployed on the NEAR blockchain, right? So this is how easy you can prototype front ends using this technology. Okay, so now you might be thinking, okay, this is a great example, right? But this is still interacting with a smart contract on NEAR, right? Didn't you mention that the blockchain operating system is chain agnostic, can actually interact with smart contracts on any blockchain, right? Well, let me show you another example here. Let's go to Lido here. So as you can see, this is a front end for the Lido component, right? If you are not familiar with that, this is one of the marquee protocols on the Ethereum mainnet, which enables users to stake their ethers and earn rewards for participating in the network consensus, right? And as you can see, this front end looks very, very similar to the official Lido components that you can find on lido.finance, right? But the difference here is that this version is actually a decentralized version, right? So the source code of this frontend is actually deployed on the blockchain, as you can see on the left side, on the panel on the left here, right? So you can actually view the source code of this frontend. You can audit it to make sure that it is trustworthy. And there's no single point of failure, right? Because this is deployed on the blockchain, so it is hosted by hundreds of nodes inside the network, right? It does not rely on a single server. Okay, so now let's take a look at the code of this component and see how you can build a component that interacts with a smart contract on another blockchain, on the Ethereum mainnet, right? So as you can see, the first block here, it's basically just checking if the user has connected their wallets, and if so, if they're on the correct network, right? If they're on the wrong network, we will prompt the user to switch to the Ethereum mainnet. So it's just a boilerplate code. And the second part here is very important, right? So this is basically specifying the Lido contract that this frontend is pointing to, right? So this is very important because this is where, as a user, as an advanced user, you want to, make sure that this is the legit, this is the real Lido contract, right? It's not pointing to a malicious contract. And similarly, this is the Lido ABI that we are fetching. And here we are basically using the ethers.js, which is whitelisted and enabled already in BOS, right? So we can use that to create an interface, which we will be using to interact with the smart contract later. And this is basically just making an HTTP GET call to get the latest staking APR from the Lido API. And then there are a bunch of helper functions. The first function here is basically to get user staked balance, right? As you can see here, we are using ethers.js library to communicate with the Lido smart contract by calling the balance off function to get the user's latest balance with Lido. And the second function here is basically to submit users' ethers for staking. As you can see, we are using ethers.js again to call the smart contract to submit users' ethers for staking. You can also write logs to the console for debugging purposes. And this part here is basically just detecting users accounts and fetch users balance in the wallet, again using ethers.js. This part here is basically calling the helper function that we defined earlier to get users staked balance. And then here, as you can see, we are making another HTTP post call to get the latest transaction cost estimate using fetch here. And finally, we are just fetching a bunch of CSS for styling. And finally, this is the output of the UI, right? And as you can see, we're seeing less than 350 lines of code. We have actually replicated the official front end of Lido protocol, right? And now we have a decentralized version of it that everyone can use. You can also fork it to add new features to it. They can also embed it into their applications, right? So one thing I mentioned earlier, in my presentation is that one of the benefits of these BOS components is that they can actually be easily reused, right, and composed into another experience or into another application. So let's say, I have a scenario right now. Let's say I am, as someone who works in Web3, right? So every month I get paid via, cryptocurrencies, right? So let's say every time when I get paid USDC, I want to convert some of my USDC into Ether, right? And then I want to use Lido to stake my Ethers because I want to support the Ethers net network, right? The Ethereum net network. So what I'm doing right now is that every time I get paid, I'll first need to go to an exchange like Uniswap or SushiSwap to swap my USDC to Ethers, right? And then I'll open another tab to go to Lido.fi, right, to stake my newly acquired Ethers, right? So this is rather inconvenient. It's quite cumbersome because I need to open multiple tabs, jump back and forth between multiple places and so forth, right? So let's say I want to create a single page, right, where I can do all the things together, right? Instead of needing to like connect my wallets, twice, open 2 tabs, jumping back and forth, right? So with BOS, we can actually easily do that by composing multiple components in one page. So let me switch to another component here. So this is another component that I put together. So what it does, it's very simple. It's actually just embedding 2 existing components from another developer into a single page, right? So we can ignore the first part here. The first part is basically checking if the user is connected to the correct network. But all it takes is actually just 2 lines of code using the widget tag, right? So by using the widget tag, I can actually embed components, that are created by other developers into my component, right? So as you can see, I'm embedding 2 components here. The first one is called swap styled. The second one is the Lido components that we just saw, right? So on the right-hand side here, if we look at the output, you can see that there are two components on this page, right? The first one is a swap component, and it actually supports multiple swaps like Uniswap, quick swap, balancer, and so forth. So I can use this component to make my swap, right, from USDC to Ether, right, every time I get paid. And then I can just go down here and use the Lido component to stake my Ethers, with Lido, all in one, right? So this is how easy users can actually compose multiple components, and reuse them, remix them to create new experiences. All right, and that's my demo for the code. And as I mentioned, so NEAR.org is just one of the many gateways out there, right? This is where users can discover all these components, but users can also discover these components in other gateways, right? So another gateway that I want to show you is called DevHub. So this is a gateway which is focused on DeFi applications. So here you can discover, front-end components for multiple chains like NEAR or ZK EVM or Mantle. And they're basically just reusing a lot of the components that are developed by other developers. And this is how easy you can actually embed this components in your existing application to create new experiences, to engage your users, and increase user engagement. Okay. So this wraps up my demo. Let me go back to my presentation. I just have a few slides left. So with the power of the blockchain operating system, so I can actually think of a lot of different use cases where developers can use the BOS, right? So number one is to use it to decentralize your applications, right? You can use it to create fully decentralized front ends like we have just seen, and also as the protocol team, you can actually also publish an official front end, right, through the BOS, but then the community can actually take it over. They can fork it, they can add new features to your front end, right? They can enhance it so that you will, in addition to the official front end, you can also have many community-run front ends, similar to the Liquidity model, right? And then if you are an L1 or L2 blockchain ecosystem, right, you can also use the BOS to create a one-stop shop ecosystem landing page, right, where users can discover all the marquee, trustworthy, real applications inside your ecosystem, so that they don't have to rely on Twitter or Telegram to discover all those different applications. And if you are running an existing Web3 application, right, you can actually easily install the blockchain operating system to add new features into your application without writing code, right? For example, as I mentioned earlier, if you're running DeFi Llama, you can actually install BOS to it and add features like Lido, like swaps into your application, right? So you don't have to write code for them. And finally, if you are running an existing Web2 application and you are considering exploring adding Web3 features into it, you can also use BOS to easily add those features to existing website or application, right? So because BOS already takes care of most of the heavy lifting for you, so you can easily add Web3 features to your application. Okay, so obviously BOS is still in its early stages because we just announced it less than 6 months ago at East Denver. but we already have many partners building on top of BOS. Let me just quickly go through a number of them. So number one is the Galaxy Space ID campaign. So Galaxy actually, they actually built a BOS component where users can participate in the Space ID campaign. They can register a BNB domain and then claim their Space ID voyage boxes all in one places, which is a great improvement in the user experience. And Polygon ZK EVM also leveraged the BOS to build a application dashboard where users can discover all the applications, all the dApps in the Polygon ZK EVM ecosystem, so which reduces friction for onboarding new users. And this morning we announced another partnership with the Mentor network. Similarly, they also launched a application dashboard for Mentor ecosystem. And Mintbase, which is an NFT marketplace, they also built a BOS component for their marketplace, so that if you are running an application, you can easily embed their NFT marketplace inside your application. For example, if you are building a game, right, you can actually have the marketplace embedded into your game so that users can trade those in-game NFTs without needing to go to a different place. And DevHub, which we saw earlier, is another gateway which provides a curated list of dApps that are that have their front end decentralized using the BOS. And NEAR Tasks is a platform where users can earn NEAR by completing simple tasks. They're building an online reputation system leveraging the BOS as well. And finally, we have PikeSpeak, which is a on-chain analytics platform, and they have an existing BOS component in which users can fork and create their custom on-chain analytics dashboard. So these are just some examples of partners building on the BOS. As we saw earlier, we already have over 10,000 components that were built on the BOS. And if you're interested in learning more about the BOS, you can go to NEAR.org to play with the BOS, and you can also find those components and see how they work. I think that's the best way to learn about the blockchain operating system. All right, so that wraps up my presentation. Let me switch back to my browser and we can take some questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, MJ, for that session.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, of course, of course. Yeah, so as you said, good time to kind of get into some questions.
Sounds good. Let me just go through here.
Yes. Just quick reminder, if you haven't put your question in the kind of questions tab yet, please do so now. I guess I'll get started. I'll read out the one from top down. All right, so the first question is from Rafa, who asks, in terms of performance, how does it scale? And how easy is it to deploy new updates? And how fast is the propagation through BOS?
Yeah, so it's highly scalable because NEAR is a sharded blockchain. So it's highly scalable. And in terms of deploying new updates, so the propagation should happen like within a few seconds because NEAR's finality is actually seconds. So it shouldn't be an issue at all. Okay,
brilliant. The next question is from Matthias, who asks, so where is the FE code fetched and already saved on chain served from to a web client?
Yeah, so the front-end code is deployed onto the NEAR blockchain in the state of its smart contract. So as I mentioned, the gateways actually provide access points where users can discover these front-end components. And what happens is that the gateway actually can communicate with RPC of the NEAR blockchain to fetch the source code, aka CSS, JavaScript, HTML from the blockchain, and then renders it to the users. And the gateway can be anything, right? We saw NEAR.org as one gateway. There are many gateways available out there, and also users can actually run a gateway locally as well. We actually have a Docker image where users can easily run a local gateway that communicates with RPC. So they don't have to rely on any third-party gateways for communicating or for interacting with the BOS.
Brilliant. I can actually see that Matthias has put in a more recent question, so I'll just address that now as well. He wrote, what I'm seeing is decentralized hosting for components. Because if I want to build a complete FE for my dApp, don't I still need to defer to using one of those gateways?
So you don't have to defer to a specific gateway, right? Because there are many gateways out there, and they are it's like distributed, right? So users don't have to go to a specific gateway to access your front end. They can use any of the gateways available out there, right? So in that case, it is decentralized, and also as I mentioned just now, users can also run their local gateway. So that's there's no dependency on a single a specific gateway.
Beautiful. Okay. There was also a question about if you could compare the cost of hosting in, say, AWS, GCP, Azure versus doing it decentralized on BOS. Apparently, it is a major consideration.
Yeah, so that's a good question, but it depends on many factors. So I would say that for it depends on the complexity of the code, right? So for a simple vanilla front end, it only costs a few maybe 10 cents or to host the code on NEAR. For a more complicated gateway with thousands of lines, might cost a few single-digit bucks or $10 to host it on NEAR, and it's it's a one-time cost. And also another thing I mentioned during my presentation is that comparing to AWS, GCP, or Azure, BOS is actually permissionless. You don't have to create an account. You don't have to put down your credit card, right? So you can just come and use it at any time and leave if you don't like it.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing. I guess the last question here is very relevant to everyone who's kind of hacking. And I guess it is a big question, so do the best that you can. Oliver has asked if you have any kind of ideas on what to build, crazy ideas or dream BOS components to build. Maybe just give some mild inspiration for the hackers for the hackathon.
Oh yeah, so we actually have a list of applications that we would love to have a decentralized version of their front end on the BOS. I believe those are friend.tech, which has been very popular in the last couple of months. Number 2 is GMX, which is a derivative protocol. And for the hackathon, I know it's very complicated. Because for the hackathon, you don't have to implement a fully fledged GMX front end using the BOS. We are just looking for something you can just simply implement a swap functionality, swap feature on top of the GMX protocol. But if you're interested in building a fully fledged GMX front end, which might be out of the scope for this hackathon, definitely come talk to us. We'd love to get connected and see if we can come up with a plan and a solution. And I think the third one is LP operations for Uniswap. So as I demonstrated earlier, we have a swap component for Uniswap where your users can trade their assets, right? But we don't have a component where users can participate as an LP in Uniswap V2 or V3. So that's also something that we are interested in seeing from the hackathon as well.
Okay, yeah. I just want to draw attention to the fact that the protocols that MJ was just talking about are on our hackathon webpage. I don't know if any of you were looking at the bounties earlier, but we actually recently updated the bounty list to kind of include this list of protocols as well. So if you want to refer back to that, just go back to the hackathon registration page. I put the link now in the chat for those of you who want to go and have a look again. Okay, just as we have a few more minutes, Matthias has asked another question.
I just saw a chat. That I mentioned that we have a Docker image for running the gateway locally, but in fact, someone is actually working on an Electron app where users can just download a DMG and install it, and you can run a gateway locally, and you can discover all the components right there. on your local machine. So yeah, so that's just another thing that's under development.
All right, cool. I'll just address this last question then, and then we'll close off the session. So Matthias has asked, I don't have to create an account, but I would still need to use my wallet to deploy and pay NEAR. So no CC, but still dollars. What about multi-sig for deployments?
Yeah, sure. So it depends on what you're looking for, right? So if you are building something kind of more Web 2, more traditional, and the KYC or like, being docs, something like that is not super important, right? So sure, right? But in Web 3, a lot of the dev teams, they're looking for something like fully decentralized, right? And not doxing themselves. So in that case, BOS is a better solution for that. And for CI/CD, like multi-sig for deployments, definitely you can set that up because NEAR has a very flexible account model. So you can create, you can set up a CI/CD pipeline for deployments for sure.
All right, amazing. I think we'll leave it at that for now. But thank you so much, MJ, for hosting today's session. It was really informative, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. Just a reminder for those of you who are thinking about the next workshop, the next session is on Monday. It's very exciting. I'd love to see you all there. But yeah, for now, cheers, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your evening.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Bye. Thank you again, MJ.